November 18, 1942. Eastern Front, near Stalingrad. In a frozen trench that reeks of death and cordite, a German soldier named Hans Müller crouches over a piece of paper torn from a propaganda leaflet. His fingers are numb with cold, but his hands shake from fear rather than temperature. Behind him, 50 meters away, stands Captain Weiss with his Luger drawn, watching for any sign of retreat. Ahead, through the morning mist, Russian positions wait in deadly silence. Dear Mother, I fear my own officers more than the enemy in front of me. The Russians might miss when they shoot. The captain behind me never does. Yesterday he put a bullet in Private Schmidt's head for taking 3 steps backward during an attack. Schmidt wasn't retreating, he was reloading. But Captain Weiss said he saw cowardice, and cowardice has only one punishment. Mother, I sleep between 2 forms of death. The enemy who wants to kill me, and my own army that will kill me if I show any human instinct for survival. The letter was discovered in 1979 during archaeological excavations of German defensive positions near Volgograd. It had been buried in a metal container along with Hans's personal effects, hidden in the moment before an attack that he apparently did not survive. For 37 years, these words lay frozen in Russian soil, a testament to the terrifying reality of an army that destroyed its own soldiers to maintain discipline. This document exposes one of the Wehrmacht's darkest secrets: the systematic use of summary execution to enforce suicidal orders. It reveals how the German military machine consumed its own personnel as ruthlessly as it attacked its enemies, creating a culture of terror that made retreat more dangerous than advance, cowardice more fatal than courage. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe so these voices are not lost. Hans Müller's letter begins with observations that establish the psychological torture endured by German soldiers caught between enemy fire and the guns of their own officers. His words reveal how the Wehrmacht's discipline system created conditions where death became preferable to disobedience, where military logic demanded the elimination of survival instincts. Every morning Captain Weiss reminds us of General Order 227. Hans writes, referring to Stalin's infamous "not one step back" directive. But Mother, we have our own version of that order, though nobody speaks it aloud. Every German soldier knows that retreat means immediate execution. The difference is that Stalin shoots his officers for failing. Our officers shoot us for being human. Hans's comparison between German and Soviet discipline systems reveals the parallel development of execution policies designed to eliminate retreat as an option for frontline soldiers. Both armies discovered that the threat of death from behind could override the instinct for self-preservation that normally led to tactical withdrawal under overwhelming enemy pressure. Wehrmacht disciplinary records, declassified in the 1990s, confirm Hans's observations about summary executions for battlefield infractions. German military courts processed over 30,000 death sentences during the war, with the vast majority carried out for cowardice, desertion, or undermining military discipline. These executions were often performed immediately, without appeal or review. Hans's letter documents specific incidents of field executions that he witnessed, providing first-hand testimony about how terror was used to maintain unit cohesion under impossible circumstances. His descriptions reveal the calculated cruelty of a system that treated human life as expendable resource. Last Tuesday, Lieutenant Weber shot Corporal Hoffman for asking permission to retrieve wounded comrades from no man's land, Hans writes. Weber said that concern for casualties indicated insufficient commitment to the attack. He made us watch while he put the pistol to Hoffman's temple. Then he ordered us to leave Hoffman's body where it fell as a reminder. Mother, we stepped over our comrade's corpse to advance toward enemy positions. How do you maintain humanity when your own officers teach you that compassion is treason? Hans's account of witnessing field executions reveals the psychological pressure created by forcing soldiers to observe the murder of their comrades while continuing military operations. The deliberate use of corpses as reminders transformed military discipline into psychological warfare against an army's own personnel. The letter provides insight into how summary execution policies affected unit morale and combat effectiveness. Hans's observations suggest that terror tactics, while preventing retreat, also destroyed the trust and cohesion necessary for effective military action. Nobody trusts anybody anymore, he writes. Men who were friends before the war now watch each other for signs of weakness that might be reported to the officers. We've become informants against each other because anyone accused of cowardice faces immediate execution. The officers have turned us into spies within our own ranks. How can we fight together when we can't trust each other? Hans's description of soldiers informing on each other reveals how disciplinary terror corrupted basic military relationships. The threat of denunciation for cowardice created an atmosphere of suspicion that undermined the solidarity normally essential for combat effectiveness. The letter documents the specific language and criteria used by officers to justify field executions. Hans's observations about how cowardice was defined and detected reveal the arbitrary nature of death sentences that could be imposed for virtually any behavior. Captain Weiss says he can see cowardice in a soldier's eyes, Hans writes. He claims to identify fear, doubt, or insufficient aggression through facial expressions and body language. Yesterday he threatened to shoot Muller for defensive thinking, because Muller suggested we might need fallback positions. Mother, we're not allowed to think about survival. Planning for retreat is treated as treason, even when retreat might save lives and preserve fighting strength. Hans's account of psychological evaluation for cowardice reveals how subjective criteria allowed officers to execute soldiers based on personal interpretation rather than specific actions. The criminalization of defensive thinking eliminated tactical flexibility while creating arbitrary grounds for death sentences. The letter reveals Hans's growing understanding that survival required not just avoiding enemy bullets but also performing acceptable levels of enthusiasm for suicidal orders. His descriptions show how soldiers adapted their behavior to avoid execution by their own officers. I've learned to smile when Captain Weiss gives impossible orders, Hans writes. I nod enthusiastically when he explains why we must attack superior enemy positions with insufficient ammunition. I volunteer for the most dangerous assignments because volunteers are less likely to be shot for cowardice. Mother, I've become an actor playing the role of a fanatical soldier because anything less than perfect performance could mean death. Hans's behavioral adaptation reveals how terror-based discipline created performative rather than genuine military motivation. Soldiers learned to simulate enthusiasm while privately understanding that their orders were suicidal, creating psychological strain that often proved more damaging than combat stress. The letter documents specific tactical situations where fear of officers prevented logical military responses to battlefield conditions. Hans's examples show how execution policies interfered with effective combat operations by eliminating rational decision-making. 2 days ago, we were ordered to attack a Russian machine gun position that had already repelled 3 assaults, Hans writes. Every soldier could see that frontal attack was suicide, but nobody dared suggest alternative approaches because questioning orders indicates insufficient commitment. We lost 18 men in 20 minutes, accomplishing nothing except proving our willingness to die on command. The machine gun position remained intact. Hans's account of futile attacks reveals how disciplinary terror prevented tactical adaptation that might have achieved military objectives with fewer casualties. The prohibition against questioning orders eliminated the flexibility necessary for effective combat operations. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. The letter reveals Hans's awareness that the execution policy was systematically destroying German military effectiveness by eliminating experienced soldiers and terrorizing survivors. His analysis shows sophisticated understanding of how terror tactics undermined their own strategic objectives. We're losing our best men to our own officers, he writes. The soldiers with combat experience know when orders are impossible, so they're the first to be shot for cowardice. The replacements are too inexperienced to recognize suicidal orders, so they die following them. Captain Weiss is creating an army of dead veterans and doomed amateurs. How do we win a war by killing our own expertise? Hans's strategic analysis reveals the self-destructive nature of terror-based discipline systems. By eliminating soldiers who possess the experience to recognize impossible situations, the Wehrmacht deprived itself of the tactical knowledge necessary for effective military operations. The letter documents Hans's growing psychological breakdown as he struggled to maintain sanity while navigating between enemy fire and friendly bullets. His words reveal the mental health crisis created by systematic terrorism within military ranks. "I don't sleep anymore," he confesses. "When I close my eyes, I see Captain Weiss pointing his pistol at my head. I hear the sound of execution shots mixing with artillery fire. I can't tell the difference between enemy bullets and friendly ones anymore. They're all trying to kill me. Mother, I think I'm going insane, but I have to hide it because showing psychological damage would be considered cowardice." Hans's mental health deterioration illustrates the psychological cost of serving in an army that treated its own soldiers as expendable resources. The prohibition against displaying psychological trauma created additional stress that compounded combat-related mental health problems. The letter provides evidence of growing resistance to execution policies among rank-and-file soldiers who recognized their counterproductive effects. Hans describes covert discussions and subtle forms of noncompliance that developed despite the risks involved. "Some of the older soldiers have started protecting the younger ones," Hans writes. "Sergeant Coke covers for men who show fear by giving them practical tasks that look like courage to the officers. He teaches us which expressions to wear, which words to use, how to perform enthusiasm convincingly. It's a dangerous game because if the officers discover the deception, everyone involved would be shot." Hans's account of protective behavior among soldiers reveals how military communities adapted to survive terror-based discipline. The development of covert support networks demonstrated resilience and solidarity despite official policies designed to eliminate both. The letter documents Hans's observations about how execution policies affected different types of soldiers and units. His analysis reveals patterns in how terror tactics were applied and their varying effects on military performance. "The officers are more likely to shoot soldiers from working-class backgrounds," Hans observes. "They seem to believe that aristocratic soldiers have inherent courage while common soldiers need terror to motivate them. The wealthy volunteers get warnings and second chances. The drafted farmers and factory workers get bullets. It's not about military performance. It's about class prejudice disguised as discipline." Hans's recognition of class bias in execution policies reveals how social hierarchies influenced life and death decisions within the Wehrmacht. The systematic application of terror along class lines demonstrated that military discipline served political as well as tactical purposes. The letter reveals Hans's growing awareness that the execution policy was part of a broader system designed to eliminate independent thinking and moral reasoning within the German military. His understanding shows how terror tactics served ideological as well as disciplinary functions. "They're not just preventing retreat," he writes. "They're preventing thought. Any soldier who questions orders, suggests alternatives, or shows concern for casualties is eliminated. Captain Weiss isn't maintaining discipline. He's creating an army of robots who follow orders without thinking. Mother, they're turning us into machines that kill and die on command." Hans's analysis of systematic thought elimination reveals how execution policies served broader political objectives beyond immediate military discipline. The creation of unthinking obedience supported ideological goals that prioritized compliance over effectiveness. The letter documents Hans's attempts to maintain moral reasoning while surviving in a system designed to eliminate ethical considerations. His struggle reveals the psychological cost of preserving humanity within dehumanizing institutional structures. "I try to remember who I was before this war," he writes. "I was a carpenter who built houses for families to live in. Now I'm a killer who destroys everything in my path because Captain Weiss will shoot me if I hesitate. How do you maintain your soul when your survival depends on abandoning everything you believe about right and wrong?" Hans's identity crisis reflects the broader psychological damage inflicted by military systems that demanded the suppression of normal moral reasoning. His struggle to preserve pre-war identity illustrates the human cost of serving in organizations that treated ethical behavior as military weakness. The letter reveals Hans's recognition that the execution policy was creating a feedback loop of brutalization that affected officers as well as enlisted men. His observations show how systematic violence corrupted entire military hierarchies. "Captain Weiss wasn't always like this," Hans writes. "Lieutenant Brenner says Weiss was different before the war, a teacher who was kind to children. But the army teaches officers that mercy is weakness, that hesitation is treason. Weiss shoots soldiers now because his superiors would shoot him for failing to maintain discipline. Everyone is trapped in a system that makes murderers of us all. Hans's recognition of systemic corruption reveals how terror-based discipline created institutional pressures that brutalized officers as well as enlisted personnel. The threat of execution for failing to execute others created vertical chains of terror that affected entire command structures. The letter documents Hans's final breakdown as he faced the impossible choice between certain death from retreat and probable death from advance. His words reveal the psychological collapse that resulted from eliminating all viable survival options. "Tomorrow we attack again," he writes in his final entry. "Captain Weiss has promised to shoot anyone who hesitates. The Russians have promised to shoot anyone who advances. I'm caught between two armies that want me dead for opposite reasons. Mother, I don't know which bullet will find me first, the enemy's or my own captain's. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore." Hans's resignation to death reveals the ultimate failure of terror-based discipline systems that created situations where soldiers preferred death to continued service. His psychological surrender illustrates how excessive coercion could destroy rather than enhance military motivation. The letter concludes with Hans's final attempt to explain his situation to his mother while preparing for what he clearly expected to be his last battle. His words reveal both love for family and despair about his military circumstances. "I want you to know that I tried to be a good soldier," he writes. "I followed orders, I fought bravely. I never retreated when advancement was possible. But this army doesn't want good soldiers. It wants dead heroes who prove their loyalty by dying on command. I'm sorry I won't be coming home, Mother. Tell Father that I died fighting. But don't tell him I died more afraid of my captain than of the enemy." Hans's final message captures the tragic irony of soldiers who maintained personal honor while serving in systems that demanded the abandonment of human decency. His distinction between being a good soldier and meeting institutional expectations reveals the moral complexity of military service during wartime. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. Hans Müller did not survive the attack he described in his final letter entry. Soviet records indicate that his unit was annihilated during a futile assault on reinforced positions near Stalingrad on November 19, 1942. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hans buried his letter and personal effects moments before the attack, perhaps hoping they would eventually reach his family. The letter was discovered in 1979 during Soviet excavations of German defensive positions being cleared for construction projects. It was preserved in the Volgograd Military Museum until German reunification allowed broader access to wartime archives. Hans's family was located in 1991, and the letter was returned to his surviving sister, who donated it to the German Federal Archives. Captain Weiss, the officer Hans feared more than enemy bullets, also died in the November 19th attack. Military records indicate he was killed by Soviet artillery while attempting to prevent retreat by threatening his own soldiers. His death removed the immediate threat to his unit, but by then the damage to morale and effectiveness had already been done. Hans's testimony has become an important document for understanding the psychological dynamics within the Wehrmacht during periods of extreme military pressure. His letter provides rare first-hand evidence of how terror-based discipline affected individual soldiers while revealing broader patterns of institutional brutalization. Dr. James Fisher, a military historian who specializes in Wehrmacht disciplinary practices, explains the significance of Hans's account. His letter documents the self-destructive nature of execution policies that were designed to prevent retreat, but actually undermined military effectiveness. Hans shows us how terror tactics created more problems than they solved while inflicting enormous psychological damage on surviving personnel. Military records from the Eastern Front support Hans's observations about widespread use of summary execution to enforce discipline. German units reported thousands of field executions for various infractions, with the majority occurring during periods of intense combat pressure, when traditional disciplinary procedures proved inadequate for maintaining order. The letter has been incorporated into military education programs that examine the relationship between discipline and effectiveness in combat situations. Hans's testimony provides concrete evidence that excessive coercion can undermine rather than enhance military performance by destroying trust, initiative, and rational decision-making. Educational institutions have used Hans's letter to teach students about the psychology of institutional violence and the effects of systematic terrorism on individual behavior. His account illustrates how organizations can become self-destructive when they prioritize compliance over effectiveness. The document has influenced contemporary discussions about military discipline and the limits of acceptable coercion in hierarchical organizations. Hans's experience provides historical evidence for arguments that terror-based motivation ultimately proves counterproductive even in extreme circumstances. Human rights organizations have cited Hans's letter in research about state violence and institutional terror. His testimony demonstrates how systematic execution policies can corrupt entire organizational cultures while creating psychological trauma that extends far beyond immediate victims. The letter serves as a reminder that institutional pressure, however extreme, cannot completely override individual moral reasoning if people retain the courage to document and resist dehumanizing practices. Hans's decision to preserve his testimony demonstrates that truth-telling can persist even under conditions designed to eliminate it. His words challenge comfortable assumptions about military heroism by revealing the complexity of courage in situations where survival requires navigating between multiple forms of mortal threat. Hans's experience illustrates how individual bravery can coexist with systemic cowardice at institutional levels. The document provides historical perspective on contemporary debates about military ethics and the responsibility of soldiers to resist unlawful orders. Hans's situation demonstrates the practical difficulties of moral behavior within institutions that criminalize ethical reasoning while demanding blind obedience. Hans Müller's letter preserves testimony about the human cost of military systems that treat soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and rational leadership. His voice speaks across the decades, carrying evidence of both institutional brutality and individual resistance to dehumanization. The letter's enduring message transcends its specific historical context to illuminate universal questions about authority, obedience, and the possibility of maintaining humanity within inhuman organizational structures. Hans's experience reminds contemporary readers that the greatest threats to human dignity often come from institutions that claim to protect it. His final written words capture the profound moral contradiction that defined his military service. "I fight not for victory or ideology or national glory. I fight because I am more afraid of the gun behind me than the gun in front of me. And I don't know which is the real enemy anymore." Hans's testimony stands as monument to the soldiers who died not for their countries or their causes, but from their own army's failure to understand that fear of death cannot create the courage necessary for victory. His letter reminds us that some victories cost more than defeat, and some discipline destroys more than chaos. The war devoured its own children, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy wore a familiar uniform.